Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Kerr, and today we have a very special and very incredible episode for you guys today. We have a guest back. It's actually the second most requested guest. It is Nightmare Vision back. You know, the most requested is Mr. Blepsama, but I don't think he may get him back soon enough, but I don't know when that will be. But we do have Nightmare Vision today, and today we're going to be discussing the Iraq War, because 20 years ago today, America brought shock and awe to Iraq, to Mesopotamia, and we're here to discuss that and the effects of that and a whole lot more. So, Nightmare Vision, how are you doing today?
I am doing wonderfully. I love being announced as second best every time when I do anything. I'm so appreciative of that. Everywhere I go, people always say that we have the second best. We couldn't get who we really wanted, so we got the next best thing. And that's just the best. An owl rather, can't ask for a better intro than that.
That's true. I could have done an owl themed intro, but I decided to do that because it is true. Second most requested. Whenever I check the YouTube comments, besides them complaining about my lack of saying Zog or something else, or complaining about something else, you know, I do see it's like, when is Nightmare Vision coming on? When is Blepsama coming on? And between the the deluge of negative comments I usually see from my great audience, but those are just the loud minority. The silent majority stands with us. But we're going to discuss the Iraq War today, and just to start off, you know, some of the Zoomers out there may not have a good memory of the Iraq War, but both Nightmare Vision and I are millennials, so we have a very good memory of the Iraq War. You know, for millennials, it was our so you would say it was our Vietnam to a degree, and it had a major impact on American life, American politics, American culture in the 2000s. It doesn't have as much effect as you would think today. I think for Zoomers, they may have just been like, what? You know, especially compared to something like Vietnam. But we'll discuss that and more. So just to begin the discussion, Nightmare Vision, where were you when the world began turning again? Because the world stopped turning after 9/11 as Alan Jackson's dead. And then we began getting the world turning again when we went after the terrorists, or the supposed terrorists in Iraq.
I was very young. I was in school, and for both 9/11 and the initiation of hostilities in Iraq, I do remember there was a teacher that was like doing. There were a few teachers in my school. I don't know how it was with you, Scott, if you remember. There were a few teachers that were like actually trying to give us like a blow by blow of the invasion of Iraq. Like the entire thing was presented back then under this term shock and awe. Which was that Colin Powell's term? I'm not sure if I remember, but
I think it was more Rumsfeld's term, but it was
maybe.
The administration really liked it. We'll double check, we'll fact check that as this podcast.
Well, it was someone's term. It was someone's term, and I do remember there was a lot. You were able to, through like radio and even the internet. The internet was around at the time. It was in a much more like premature, maybe even superior stage than it is now. I don't even know. But you were able to kind of have this live coverage through television, all these different forms of media of like the troop movements. It was kind of given a very traditional treatment, even though the war didn't really turn out that way, and its impression on the public ended up being way less popular over time. Initially, you kind of had like, you know, the maps with the giant black arrows, you know, showing where troop movements were and like where we were deploying exactly in the country and all of these things. And I remember there were a few teachers in school that were like very excited to kind of talk about that. They were kind of giving it this World War II style, you know, like we're heading in, you know, it's like, while you were asleep under the cover of darkness, you know, on the opposite end of the world, this was going on. And but that was kind of short-lived. That was like a very introductory aspect. I don't know if it lasted weeks or months, but you know, relative to the entire occupation of Afghanistan too and Iraq, it was only like a short while of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, a traditional war, I think, was only over in like a month or 2 months at most, and then we just had an insurgency to deal with, which the teachers weren't going to give you a blow by blow of where the IEDs went off today and where they're kidnapping leaders and killing them. I don't think they were going to do that for the war yet. No, I have similar memories of that. I don't remember if there was teachers really boosting it, but I remember the local radio. Like every radio station was boosting the war. I grew up in Nashville, so it was still very conservative. Well, still conservative in the surrounding areas, and it was very conservative back then. Very southern too, much more southern culturally and socially back then than it is now. When I was there, any radio station they would have, they would play these songs, and if it was like the pop station or the regular rock station, they're playing like Nickelback, and because Nickelback, Creed's still a little, still big at that time, so they're playing like a Nickelback song. It's like, "This is how you remind me," and then they have like a Bush clip thing. Is like, "We will not negotiate with terrorists." And I'm like, what? And they would intersperse these clips of like Dick Cheney or Bush or some general talking, or like Colin Powell, and they would have that in like a Nickelback song or whatever the big pop songs. Have Avril Lavigne come? I think Avril Lavigne had made. Maybe they even did that with Skater Boy. I think Skater Boy was already out by that time in the early 2000s. So they would have those songs, and obviously, most of the country radio stations there were country, and the country radio stations were, they were excited for the war. They were pumped up for this. They're like, hell yeah, and they would cut into those like songs just to talk about how awesome the Iraq War is going to be. I remember when their morning shows they would have there on the radio stations, they would celebrate everything. I remember when Saddam Hussein was captured in Tikrit. I'm probably not even pronouncing it correctly, but I'm making an attempt to. And all the country stations were like, he got captured in Tikrit. We're going to call it Tikrit. We're not going to call it Tikrit. It's Tikrit. And he got there. He was in his little spider hole. We got him. We got that bastard. And they're like going all in about this, which is, maybe you could see the same thing that happened when we killed Osama bin Laden back in 2011. But for, even with some Zoomers, they might not have that strong of a memory of it. But for, since then, at least since, 2011, you haven't really seen this. Like, you turn on the TV and it's very jingoistic. It's very over the top patriotic, very bombastic. It's like, hell yeah, America just blew away some terrorists, which now, like, if you turn on the TV to have any really over the top celebration of patriotism, it's about how we're like the leader in LGBT rights or something. That's really what we need to talk about, how America's awesome. But it was very much the country coming around, rallying around this effort to support the Iraq War. And also that brings up the Dixie Chicks, because obviously that was a big news item in Nashville as the country music capital. Dixie Chicks were a huge country artist at the time. And for those who might not remember this, because I know there's we keep bringing up the Zoomers, but the Dixie Chicks were, as I said, a huge country artist. They're having top charting singles on the country music charts. And they were at a concert, I think in the UK. And they said, we're embarrassed about Bush too, and we like oppose this war. And it's like a very, compared to what like celebrities' political statements they make today, it was like very milk toast. And when they did that, you would have thought that they said, we hope all these American soldiers die. Death to America. Hail Saddam. Hail the Iraqis. Hail those people. They would have thought that that's what they said with their thing, because there was so much backlash against the Dixie Chicks for having this rather mild criticism of Bush overseas. And country music immediately stopped playing their radio stations immediately stopped playing their song. They were taking their CDs and out of the record store, because we still had record stores at that time, and destroying the CDs in these public demonstrations against the Dixie Chicks. And they'd have like callers call in talking about how they need to strap all the Dixie Chicks to bombs and drop them over Baghdad. And you're just like, and the radio station host would be like, I agree 100%. Let's drop them over Tikrit. And so they, and this is the type of reaction which now you can have country singers talk about how Nashville or Tennessee are bigots for going against transgender stuff, and they'll keep playing the records and interviewing these people. So it's a very different time period, especially even with country music. I'm sure you have some thoughts about the Dixie Chicks and just the reaction or how America was preparing for the war, and people overreacting to any criticism of the war effort.
Yeah, I mean, the general picture of this, historically, the way I would put it is that like, after 9/11, George Bush was basically given like infinite political capital. Right? Like he basically was put in a position where he was the president during this like unprecedented, terrible domestic attack that was just like awful, like horrifying, like right, like we spoke about this on a 9/11 retrospective, but for like people above a certain age that I remember when I was a child, like they couldn't even watch replays of 9/11 without having like some sort of like PTSD episode. Like people like boomers, older Gen X people, they 9/11 was, I mean, I found it like kind of appropriately horrifying too, but not in that way. Maybe it's just because I'm like younger, because I'm like internet poisoned or whatever. Like I didn't like look at
it. That's how people felt. I mean, that Alex Jackson song we joked about, or I joked about earlier, like where were you when the world stopped turning? That really impacted song, even though now we listen to it today and we're like, this is so hokey. But at that time, people were like crying listening to that song.
It's true. Yeah.
Like old, grizzled men in their 40s were like crying listening to that.
So George Bush was given this like, yeah, he was given like a massive level of political capital, and basically within the year he made it very clear that all of it was going to be spent on the Iraq war. I mean, he tried to do a few other things in his administration, like stuff with like Medicare and Social Security and stuff, and that wasn't real. Oh, and immigration also, by the way. But the Iraq
wanted
war,
to pursue amnesty before 9/11 happened, so 9/11 may have killed amnesty back in 2001.
Yeah, and so yeah, he did these other things, but the Iraq war was the big ticket item that he was going to sink it. Like he used to talk about this a lot, and so would his administration and his defenders, like Karl Rove and stuff. They would talk about how like history. You probably remember this a little bit, Scott, right? It was like a weird way that neoconservatives would talk back then. They would talk about like the historical record and the way history will judge our actions and stuff. It was very kind of weird way to put it. And they were always talking about how history will judge this moment and this decision. And part of the reason they did that was because initially they had overwhelming public support for basically anything they were doing after 9/11. And this lasted even into the beginning of Iraq. And so when you're describing like the Dixie Chicks and stuff, this was kind of like the beginning of the end of that kind of unified view of things, where it started to become basically by the time the 2004 presidential election rolled around, Iraq, and prior to that, really, Iraq was a very divisive topic. But like I said, right after 9/11, George Bush was kind of able to do whatever he wanted, and he sunk it all into Iraq. And so that was kind of the support for the Iraq war in its initial phases was, in a way, the last gasp of, I mean, as bad as it is to say, anything that looks like traditionally patriotic, unified American consciousness and will pursuing like some sort of project or some combat, like, you know what I mean? Like the people kind of rallying together and supporting the troops, so to speak, for some like massive engagement. Like again,
nationalism.
It kind of all relates to World War II. You know what I mean? It's all like World War II, especially at that era. I mean, today World War II is kind of mostly used for like things like the Holocaust and things like that. But there is like an alternate kind of consciousness of World War II in the American for the American public that kind of doesn't exist much anymore. I think because a lot of the greatest generation are just gone now, but just seeing it as this like heroic struggle, as like a very American thing, like another good war for us to fight. And they definitely wanted the public to view Iraq as if it were like another good war, because it was in the wake of 9/11 and the associations were very strong in the public mind. And so that's kind of the context for not just the Dixie Chicks and everything like that, but the you know, it was that's what I mean. It's kind of hard to say like it was the last expression of like not everyone, but like an overwhelming kind of sense of patriotism because it was terribly misdirected. But that's kind of how it felt at the time, right? Like when you're talking about like you know, Southerners trying to just like, you know, art like pronounce like you know, the names of cities in Iraq and stuff like that. They like it was very silly. It was absurd in a lot of ways, but it wasn't weird really then at the time because yeah, it was just seen as them like supporting a it was like Bush was another FDR, Iraq was Germany, basically. You know what I mean? It was kind of
Our
seen as like
soldiers
a
are the band
replay.
of brothers that we just watched.
Yeah,
On
like
HBO. Yeah.
exactly. So as misguided as it was, I feel like there's a two-pronged or parallel kind of way to describe these things where it's like the psychology is important there, even though like the actual material reality on the ground didn't really match up with it, which is kind of what made the era so absurd in the rearview mirror. But yeah, the psychology, I'm just trying to explain like where people's heads were at, like they're playing like George Bush clips over like, you know, pop rock songs and stuff like that. Like back then people actually found that
Three
like
Doors Down.
yeah, they found that like powerful. Like that's so silly. It's like really silly to say, but like people found that stuff unironically powerful at the time, you know.
Yeah, no, it's something that's hard to say, especially with our you know, the amount of irony among American public. I mean, just imagine like Zoomers tuning into Ariana Grande or Doja Cat, and then you have like patriotic speeches from Joe Biden. You know, it's like people would be like, "What the hell is this?" Like they would never allow that today. But you know, you do have that point about the type of patriotism that was going on in America, and it was something is very much like the ultimate peak of civic nationalism because and I always bring up this advertisement all the time. I definitely brought it up in our 9/11 retrospective where the ad council which put out this ad where it's like I am an American right after 9/11, and the whole ad it's featuring people who largely non-white, some of them having trouble speaking English. I think even like a few people say it in like their native tongue. I am an American, and it's trying to present this like America as this great melting pot where everyone unites together under the stars and stripes. And that was a very powerful motif back in that time, and that's very much the nationalism that was promoted by George W. Bush, and it was helped along by what was going on in the media at the time because there was all of these very popular patriotic war movies that came out either you know right before 9/11 and or during that time unintentionally probably during that time because some of these movies were made you know in their 2001 before we even knew 9/11 was going to was going to happen, and that was really what set the stage because we had Saving Private Ryan which presented the war as this all American, you know, white ethnics and everyone else coming together to fight in Nazi Germany. You had then Band of Brothers, which carried that along, and that came out in 2001. Then in early 2002, you had Black Hawk Down, which definitely was getting probably helped military recruitment with that as like this patriotic struggle of even though there's kind of a unintentional racist message of Black Hawk Down where it's all these Chad white Americans being surrounded by Somalis, but that's another topic. And then you also in 2002 you had We Were Soldiers, the Mel Gibson Vietnam War movie, also presenting which that was very different from most Vietnam War movies of the 80s, which those movies like Platoon, Metal Jacket, those are presenting it as like the bad war, and it's like there's nothing patriotic here. While We Were Soldiers is like we're kicking Vietnamese ass, and these guys are unquestionable heroes, and we support them. And so this was really creating that groundwork for guys to sign up and thinking that they're doing the ultimate act in patriotism by serving. It was very popular in the country at the time, and as I said, like it was Toby Keith nationalism afterwards. I mean, that song, courtesy of the Red, White, and Blue, both the Alan Jackson, Where Were You When the World Stopped Turning, and Toby Keith's courtesy of the Red, White, and Blue capture what a majority of Americans were thinking. They were very sad and very distraught over 9/11, but there was also this desire for revenge. And this desire, the American public probably for worse, wanted a war out of 9/11. It did not feel its bloodlust over 9/11 was not satisfied by Afghanistan. And Bush and admin, they realized this, and they realized that they could redirect this into Iraq war, which they wanted. All these people like Paul Wolfowitz and others, they wanted to go in Iraq and they wanted to take out Saddam. The American public was primed for that. And the popularity of these songs like Courtesy Red, White, and Blue was like, we wanted to put a boot in your ass. It's the American way. Well, we had put our boot in the ass of the Taliban and Al Qaeda in Afghanistan, but we wanted to do more. And Bush came up with the Iraq War, and that's why it had so much popular support. But it's probably the last time you could ever get an intervention like that due to the fractured nature of America today, or at least with political polarization and actually the real feeling of civic nationalism that unites people together. Like, most people are not as patriotic as they were 20 years ago. And they're not going to be convinced to be patriotic by inserting Biden clips into Doja Cat songs on the radio. They're not going to be wanting a war over this, unless there was something like 9/11 to motivate them. But even if there was a 9/11, I'm not even quite sure that would have as unifying effect as it did over 20 years ago. So it was something to just say is that the American public at that time really wanted a war, wanted more than a war than what we did in Afghanistan. It really wanted to sweep away the Middle East and avenge those who died in 9/11. And it was still, that's what was the feeling. And yeah, so we did have that type of. What I do agree with your point that it was like the last gasp with that unifying nationalism, and it's never likely again. I guess that's a good thing because we probably will not have another Iraq war. But
talking about the public's bloodlust not being sated is actually it's a little bit funny in a way, because now, when you look back on it, there was this kind of very ridiculous contrast between how America viewed itself and how we wanted to view our potential enemies in the wake of 9/11 versus the reality. And so there was this desire for a victory in a conventional World War II style combat, just updated for the 90s and the early 2000s technology wise. But then when people actually saw the footage from Afghanistan, it was there was no satisfaction there whatsoever. It's this place is just a completely uncivilized, unpopulated desert, and there is no kind of civilized power versus civilized power, or industrial countries going to war with one another. It's just us occupying these vast swaths of totally barren rocky hills. And with Iraq, it kind of reached an even higher level of absurdity, because for Iraq, the idea was okay, now we actually have a nation state, a nation state that we can use as the object of our ire. But then when that invasion began, it quickly became apparent that not really. Iraq also wasn't going to serve as this formidable nation state that we were going to take down. They did try, people, maybe people listening can remember or have seen on the internet videos of us tearing down the Saddam Hussein statue or whatever. And there was a lot of propaganda at the time talking about Iraq's forces. As soon as the hostilities began in Iraq, they were starting to talk about Iran. You have to remember that, the neoconservatives that were basically completely running the Republican Party and the conservative movement at the time with an iron fist, right? A lot of them had their sights set on Iraq even prior to 9/11, and a lot of them ultimately had their sights set on Iran too. And so soon after, now Iran does actually serve a kind of this, does fulfill this role I'm describing as a formidable nation state. And so like right away, the idea was that like, Iran has interests in Iraq. They're sending, troops, and they were kind of trying to build that case up too slowly. But at the time, yeah, Iraq, we kind of just did everything we needed to do there relatively quickly. And then when we got there, it was like, it also didn't really serve as this like really formidable enemy. But again, like it was a nation state. And the idea, like the context here is important, that like after 9/11, the idea was that the entire Middle East is a potential threat to the US. And we, like the Bush administration was saying that like it's in our national security interest to basically reserve the right to pursue hostilities with like any inside any country. That was kind of what the global war on terror was, right? Like, so we may not be launching a conventional war against countries in the Middle East and Africa, but we reserve the right to basically occupy any of these places as we see fit. And so that kind of ties into why the justification for the Iraq war ended up becoming so politicized, because it was like a really bad case. It was like a really bad case. It was very abstract. It was like, we're kind of going to try to remake the Middle East into a bunch of Western style democracies. And there was a lot of weird ideas that like, if we can take over Iraq and completely transform its political institutions, we can all of a sudden, there will be these like internal revolutions in like Syria and Iran and, all these other countries, because they'll see how amazing Iraq becomes once it turns into like this American style democracy. And that is prior to that, the idea, like I said, was that all of these countries are potential threats. Iraq basically is right now has scientists tinkering with an atom bomb that they're going to drop on LA or New York or Washington, D.C. And if we don't act now, the idea was that like they did, you remember, Scott, it was very like, people are kind of very reckless with their words in the Bush administration and in the media at large. The idea was that like, we don't want to say that if we don't go to war in Iraq, they're going to drop a nuclear bomb on us, or they're going to start like using chemical weapons on the American population. But like, we kind of are saying that, like, we're, what I mean? Like, basically that is
people
what's
thought that they were like, Iraq was going to invade us. Like, the rhetoric that was happening was like, we have to fight them over there so they don't come here. That was like the most popular argument, was that in itself. Is like, and even as a kid, when I heard these arguments, it's like, I don't know how the hell Iraq is going to get to like Florida. How are they going to get over here? And so, but they're like, we have to fight them over there so they don't come here. While meanwhile, we're doing nothing about immigration. At that time, the Bush administration was totally on board with open borders and having more immigrants come here. So that just made no sense at all. That if we don't invade Iraq, like somehow, like this weak state in the Middle East is going to turn into Hitler, and the Iraqi Navy is going to be showing up in Miami. And I was like, I don't know how that's going to work. But that was what people believed, is that it's for, the nation was going to be invaded. The nation was going to be nuked if we did not go over there. That was the common sentiment, is that we had to. And so I guess people had the not even lingering memory, the very fresh memory of 9/11 in their minds, and they thought that without taking out Iraq, we could have even more 9/11s, and so that was something that was driving them.
Yeah, the idea, Scott, was that we were in like a post 9/11 world now. That was like the rhetoric coming out of the administration, that we're in this post 9/11 world, and like any kind of casual dismissal of like, like a literal Iraqi invasion of like the East Coast of America, like dismissing that out of hand as like a completely ridiculous notion, suddenly made you this naive dupe who you just don't understand the new world that we live in. You don't understand the post 9/11 context, where like you couldn't balk at like any perceived threat. You had to take everything seriously. And to the extent that you dismissed it, you were like an idiot. Like, you didn't understand how 9/11 changed everything, which is like really manipulative, because of course 9/11 did change a lot, like emotionally, for people. It was really hard for them to witness and stomach or whatever. But the idea was that it fundamentally like it rewrote the rules for like how America ought to relate to the rest of the world, you know. And let me just make a side comment that like talking about how would like a homeland invasion of America actually work. I mean, it's kind of a judgment of the Bush administration, George Bush, and all like the entire conservative movement that like when we talk about how subsequent to 9/11, George Bush was handed like infinite political capital. He could have become Trump. I mean, he could have done the right thing. He could have said, you know, these people should never have been in the country. We're closing the borders. We're going to start deporting people by like the busload and plane load. Like, we are not going to let these people have access to the country. Like, we're going to build the wall, et cetera, et cetera. Like,
there was popular support. It was majority support for that, but obviously,
exactly.
The sad fact is that Bush was never going to do that because Bush was an immigration booster for a long time, and there wasn't even much leadership. I mean, Trent Lott, who was Senate Majority Leader at the time, who's most remembered for saying that if Strom Thurmond had been elected president in 1948, we wouldn't have these problems today. He said that in actually right before the Iraq War, which Strom Thurmond ran on a segregationist platform. That was like pretty much the only thing he ran on, and he had to resign from his leadership position over that statement. He was sort of pushing in a more stronger immigration restrictionist line, but obviously he got toppled down. But everyone else in Republican leadership was like, let's have more immigrants. This will show the terrorists.
Yeah, we had actually more Islamic. We've had more Muslim immigrants come into this country after 9/11 than before. See, part of the problem here, Scott, is that like in a lot of ways, what I want to say about this is that like a lot of what made this era so bad was that basically almost every liberal criticism of the right at this time was like 100% correct, right? And it was a very ridiculous era for the conservative movement. And in a lot of ways, right, they still kind of haven't, like Trump was like this huge blessing to them, but a lot of them still kind of haven't realized it because of their age and their inability to understand things, and also a lot of them are just compromised figures or whatever. They still kind of haven't shaken off the errors of the post 9/11 American political scene. But yeah, like this is not an aspect that even liberal criticisms whatever, or the liberal criticism would ever bring up. You know what I mean? Like that, like this is kind of one of the most important criticisms you can make of our policy post 9/11, that essentially it kind of did give us a green light to pursue this like really sensible, restrictionist, kind of nationalist set of goals. But like that's never going to come. Only you and I are going to make that criticism, or like maybe some other people now. You know what I mean? Like it's one of those things that like should be obvious, but of course, the Bush administration and American liberals basically all agree on this, which is something at the time you weren't really allowed to point out because George Bush was elevated to. It's kind of funny, like the Bush administration tried to turn Saddam Hussein into another Hitler, but domestically, Democrats tried to turn George Bush into another Hitler.
That's right. It's
once the war kind of cratered in popularity, and so. You know, one of the reasons that kind of like retrospectives like this are good is because a lot of times in America at the time, you know, these people seem engaged in this like really contentious debate. But then when a little time passes, you're able to kind of look at it from a big picture perspective, and you're able to see like these people didn't really fundamentally disagree on much. And so this is one of those areas where like, yeah, basically the Republicans, the left and right were kind of, at least the establishments or whatever, were completely unified on like, well, whatever the response to these attacks are, we're not going to actually, you know, restrict immigration, close the borders, or start actually pursuing things that would really materially benefit us. You know what I mean?
And the point of America is to spread our wonderful ideas to every part of the globe, which all liberals now believe in that. It was funny. You know, people talk about like the Trump is Hitler Nazi stuff, but there was so much of that back in the 2000s. And even people like, this is what happens with 1984, and we're losing our democracy. And there are all these illusions, and liberals suddenly discovered they love the Constitution. And one aspect they were a little bit more correct, because even though the right always talks about now, or the new right, or whatever you want to call it, talks about we need to use state power and screw the Constitution. We're going to do this to use state power against our enemies. George W. Bush did use state power against his enemies. He even used state power to kidnap and torture his enemies all over the world. And some people, the problem is, it turned out to be very cringe, because it was directed in towards this imperialist project of spreading democracy around the world rather than anything in space. But it's like funny that in like that way with Bush, he could be the one who used state power. They always like to say that conservatives never use state power, but unfortunately, Bush did. But he used it for very cringe
No, it is.
reasons.
It's a great point, Scott, because it's quite damning. Because the same conservatives that now, they became so hysterical over Trump. A lot of these guys were actually apologists for George Bush being like just like a totally
torturing,
like a dictator overseas. Yeah, like they were arguing under this guy at the time who was very big on the right, who like completely vanished. Do you remember John Yoo, Scott? Like John Yoo was seen,
John Yoo, yeah,
he was this Asian American who was seen as like basically the architect of this really kind of expansive, imperialistic, neocon driven understanding of the presidency, where like essentially he was allowed to do anything he wanted to do. And just to your point, it's like a lot of the people that were supporting this after 2016 were like the same people that were pretending that like Trump was this like Hitlerian dictator shredding the Constitution because he wanted to like control our border. Like just like 10 years prior, a lot of these same people were arguing that like George Bush should have like just solely like the sole authority to be able to like disappear anybody on the planet if it were like just at his own whim and discretion. So
he
it's
was
like,
doing that to a large extent. It's liberals don't even care about. I mean, I did an IQ supplement recently on the movie Vice, which is very much, came out in 2018, but you would have thought it came out in 2008 with its obsession with the Bush administration and Dick Cheney, who now Bush and Dick Cheney have been rehabilitated in their opposition to Trump. Bush is now considered one of the most popular presidents, according to one poll, and people are like, what? And complete rehabilitation just simply because he attacks Trump and hugs Michelle Obama, that he now has this, and he appears to be such a good man that everyone has forgotten about how horrible of a president he was, and he did nothing good. But that is the impression. But in this movie, in Vice, it's portraying the like Bush is like shredding the Constitution and is this dictator, or more that Dick Cheney was a dictator. But now, like, liberals wouldn't even say that. They the movie director did not get the memo that no, we need to show Trump for doing that. But with Trump, it's like the aspects of showing him as a dictator, which is that he was mean to journalists. Meanwhile, Bush is ordering the torture and kidnappings of all these people, and he's issuing a war. He's starting a war for, he lied to the American public to get into the war. And all these things that happen, it's like, there's no comparison there. But that is like shows one of the long-term effects of it. As unlike our Vietnam, you don't feel that there's this long-lasting haze, I guess, or a malaise from it, or this hangover from the Iraq War as there was from Vietnam. I mean, with Iraq War was a disaster for America. I mean, we lost a ton of money there, we lost a ton of clout around the world. We got in this messy quagmire that we didn't imagine was going to happen. Once we left, and even though we did have ISIS come back, I mean, we bounced back from Iraq and we started doing more minor interventions all over around the world. But Vietnam really wrecked American military power, wrecked America's like sense of itself and its psyche, which Iraq, long term, did not have that effect. At the time of the 2000s, you thought it was like the most important issue, but now hardly anyone remembers it. I mean, the 20th anniversary is not being memorialized as much as you would think, especially compared to the 20th anniversary of 9/11. or any of these things. These are moving into the past, and public consciousness of it is not as strong as it was for Vietnam or World War II. It's just something that was like, oh, it was a blunder, it was a mistake. Oh well, we moved on from it to other ideas, and that's something that needs to be remembered about the effect of it. And 2016 was probably the last time that Iraq was a serious issue in American politics, and it was bearing it as a serious issue in American politics because 2008 presidential election, 2000, even the 2012 election, it still had an influence. But in 2016, when Bernie Sanders tried to run against Hillary Clinton on her support for the Iraq War, it just didn't connect with that Democratic audience at all. It was only the Bernie bros, who are a specific set of millennials and Gen Xers, who really remember and care about the Iraq War, that connected to. But other Democratic voters like, oh well. And then on the other side with Republicans, well, prior to Trump, like, Republicans were still defending the Iraq War. I remember when Trump was first criticizing the Iraq War, early stages of the primary, all these respectable conservative commentators would come out and say, we did find weapons of mass destruction. This is a lie. He's spreading a lie that we didn't find weapons of mass destruction. Actually, fact check, we did, which we did. We found some like old unused weapons of mass destruction that couldn't even been used. So we didn't really find any active WMDs at that time. But Bush went up on the primary debate stage, South Carolina, a state that was fervently in support of the Iraq War, and he said Bush lied, and he won that state. That effectively said the Republican Party has moved on from Iraq. It no longer cares about relitigating the war. It's moving on in a different direction. And so it doesn't really have that impact that Vietnam had, long after. I mean, we were afraid to go into the first Persian Gulf War because of Vietnam, which, we didn't worry about like supplying the Ukrainians with as much weapons and military aid as possible in last year. And even with Libya, Libya, we were still in Iraq when we got involved in Libya, and still people supported it at that time. That would have been like in Vietnam when we were about to leave Vietnam. We get involved into another third world country's war. That would be the equivalent of it. So it didn't really have this long-term effect on America compared to other wars. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, what makes this jarring, Scott? I feel like bringing up again, it's weird to bring up Trump in the context of the Iraq War, but in terms of like era-defining moments, this guy really did like single-handedly bury the Iraq War for the right, and there was no one else that was going to do that. We'd probably still have candidates today running for president in 2024 on the Republican ticket who would still be talking about Iraq now if it weren't for Trump. And that's like so ridiculous to say, but that's really how bad the right has been in America now for decades, with Trump being like the sole exception pretty much. And when you bring up the reaction to Trump's condemnation of the Iraq War during the 2015 and 2016 primaries, it's really it's important to understand like the context there. The reason why those people kept bringing up how awful his comments regarding the Iraq War were at the time was because at the height of the Iraq War, and even into the early Obama administrations, basically from 2001 to like 2008, 2010 or whatever, that really would have sunk you on the right. People like the Iraq War issue, it swallowed our politics generally, but it completely redefined the right in America. After 9/11, after the initial invasion of Iraq, to be a conservative was to be an Iraq War supporter, and to not support the Iraq War was to not be a conservative. Like I kind of mentioned this earlier. I was hinting at the kind of vice grip that neoconservatives had on the right for this entire time, and it was like unbelievable. People talk about canceling now. I mentioned this on one of the other shows we did, Scott. I think it was about Bari Weiss and, people talking about like cancel culture and stuff. And I made this point that, again, I've not really heard from other people, but like you know, if there were ever people who like perfected the art of canceling people first, it really was the conservative movement in the Iraq War era. But it wasn't because of like the Dixie Chicks. That wasn't like that's just like liberals trying to like kind of revise American history post 9/11 to be like more dystopian than it really was. It really though was the conservative movement internally. They were able to turn the slightest deviation from supporting the Iraq war from like a solitary figure, a journalist, a pundit, a columnist, they were able to elevate that deviation into like a mortal sin that required this person to be completely excised from the right and like never seen again, never invited anywhere again. Like they really were able to ruin your career if you were not an ardent supporter of the Iraq war. And so subsequent to the invasion on the right, like I said before, to be a conservative meant to support the Iraq war, and to not support it meant no matter how right-wing, you know, you were ostensibly, it meant you were not on the right. And you know that's like where figures like, you know, like Joe Lieberman, for instance, come into relevancy. You have this guy who's like essentially like as a liberal Jewish Democrat, stereotypically as you could possibly imagine. And just because this guy, for his own like kind of like I don't know, like quasi semi-Zionist reasons or whatever, he was just like a total Iraq war supporter. He became like completely ingratiated to the Bush administration. He was allowed on conservative talk radio. Like these people who like absent the Iraq war, they had nothing but like hatred and loathing for the kind of person who would be listening to like, you know, conservative talk radio or the typical Bush voter or whatever. These guys were basically given like a completely open, warm invitation to like just speak on all matters right wing and to become arbiters for who was and who wasn't allowed to voice their opinion in American conservatism. And it pretty much all came down to whether you were a supporter of the Iraq war or not. It reached like absurd degrees.
Yeah, that was the defining issue for the right at that time. And even like people today who, some people were able to maintain their careers by being very pro Iraq war, even though they maybe changed their mind. Like Ann Coulter was very pro Iraq war. Tucker Carlson was initially, but if you were anti Iraq war, you were excised from the movement. As Pat Buchanan learned, you know, he had to go on MSNBC to be their. Back then, their never Trump, the equivalent to never Trump conservatives were anti-war conservatives that would be led on, and it was really just like Pat Buchanan, and that's it. And even people who adopted that position, like anti-war position, and long-term hurt paleocons a lot because it made them seem like libtards to the average Republican, you know, person.
Yeah.
And I think in some of the paleocons decided to lean hard into that, like being libtard. I mean, American Conservative Magazine, which was founded by Pat Buchanan and some others, in response, actually directly due to, you know, the Iraq War or the buildup to the Iraq War in 2002, you know, it became very cringe throughout the time period. I mean, it sometimes gets some good articles and in the post-Trump era, but it became so leaning so hard into being libtardism due to being excised from the conservative movement and from right wing in general, and from being so disconnected from the ordinary Republican voter that it was, that if an ordinary Republican was reading their stuff, they would think these guys are weepy liberals. And even nobody at American Conservative even supported Trump at that time because they've been so mind-mogged about what had happened during Iraq War. So they got all these elements, and so it left in these neocons, and that was what was dictating foreign policy up until Trump. I went to a CPAC in 2011. You know, it was like clear that Iraq War had been a failure, and we were still trying to do these failures everywhere else. And anytime there's a foreign policy discussion, you know, they have these, you know, experts come on, they're talking about how we need to do more interventions, like be more aggressive, like Obama is not doing enough to support the Arab Spring and all this nonsense. And that was still conservative, you know, set conservative foreign policy at the time, even though libertarianism was gaining some traction through Ron Paul and some others. Well, really at that time, just Ron Paul. But it was still, that was the definite minority position. The majority position was still neoconservatism well into the 2010s, up until Trump changed that. And so that was a real blessing when it occurred.
It was incredibly awkward though, Scott, right? Like I remember was it 2008 where Ron Paul was trying to run this like shoestring insurgent kind of campaign where he was able to kind of run to everybody's right in terms of conservative rhetoric, but then also like the centerpiece, what kind of doomed him, unfortunately, was like the centerpiece of his campaign was that like we can't do any of this stuff until we just completely repudiate the last 8 years of American foreign policy. And it was just so awkward for the conservatives at the time because you basically had Ron Paul being interviewed by like complete retards like Sean Hannity, where Sean Hannity was like, "How long have you supported the terrorists, sir?" And it was just like, oh man, you know what I mean? Like you couldn't.
They called him a 9/11 truther just for simply saying, "Well, this is caused by us being in the Middle East." And like, I remember Rudy Giuliani when he said this. Ron Paul said that at a 2000 debate, and Rudy Giuliani is like, "I am appalled that someone would dare even say this, and I demand an apology." And then the whole crowd roared and
the outrage
Rudy Giuliani for like calling out Ron Paul's trutherism, blaming America for terrorism.
Like Ron Paul,
it's true. It did alienate the average Republican voter, unfortunately.
Yeah, it was the most awkward. Like Trump is actually important here because the Trump era, rather, for understanding kind of 9/11, because at least from your perspective and from my perspective, right, the post 9/11 policy that was implemented by the Bush administration caused this massive misalignment. This is kind of what we're getting at, right, Scott? It caused this like massive misalignment on the right and on the left too, to an extent, where people basically became strange bedfellows. So like the post 9/11 era, the Iraq War era domestically for the Republicans created this really weird like relationship where you had like Jewish neoconservatives like Bill Kristol or whatever that were kind of like the heads of an army that consisted of people that dressed and sounded like Toby Keith. And it was very clear at a certain point that this relationship had literally zero coherence to it. It made absolutely no sense. But the problem was that it was so entangled in our post 9/11 kind of political consciousness that it was just almost impossible to undo. And so the reason why I brought up Ron Paul was because this guy who was like, more American than apple pie, like, this like avuncular figure from like Texas who was just like, he was like very American, right? He was basically having his like patriotism or his like loyalty to America like brought into serious disrepute because he was trying to like disentangle this knot, so to speak, and it was just so entrenched that he just had zero shot. And so it required time passing, and it required, like you were saying, the kind of smoke of the Iraq War, the disaster that it was, to kind of clear, and then someone like Trump, who was like really bombastic, to thread this needle where like he could somehow have the voter base view him as like a non-weak candidate, a patriotic person, but who at the same time was kind of like completely repudiating our post 9/11 policy. He doesn't really get credit for that, Scott, but it is almost like a parlor trick. Like it was like a balancing act that was almost impossible to pull off because conservatives just became so dumb and so morally compromised in our post 9/11 era that they really had no way. Like Ann Coulter's a really good example. Like Ann Coulter has like completely flipped the script, but she never had some peace, as far as I know, she never had some like peace or some public moment where she was like, I was wrong on everything. You know what I mean? Like there were a few figures like that where they just kind of understood that, okay, I basically spent 8 years caping for people that hated me and hated the Republican voter base. And they realized it And they're like, I'm just not going to do that anymore. And there were a few standout figures on the right that like obviously underwent that transformation. There were, Michelle Malkin and, Laura Ingraham, Ann Coulter. I guess Tucker Carlson kind of counts. I don't, yeah, he was kind of always like a more libertarian kind of guy. But there were a few
I think
figures
he
that,
gave up on Iraq war earlier than that. I think
yeah,
he was already
probably.
opposed by 2004, 2005.
But it was just a really awkward, what I'm trying to get at was the stranglehold on the right during the Iraq war invasion and even subsequent into like 2011. It was so strong, and kind of undoing it was just this really awkward, like no one could have done it in 2006, for instance. You know what I mean? No one could have done it 2004, 2005. Like it was like the sole kind of genre defining issue for the entire political spectrum on both sides. And you basically couldn't present yourself as someone who was like deviating from it in any way. And so it just took time, and then someone like Trump to kind of finally kick over the sandcastle that was like completely dried out at this point and just like left in the sun way too long. And it like I said, he doesn't really get credit for that, because like I said, like look at some of the people who are trying to run for president in 2024, Nikki Haley, like these like, these people still like, I'm pretty sure Nikki Haley would still be talking about, she might have already done this in the past year. She might have mentioned Iraq. Like they still have no idea how to let go of this issue if it wasn't for just like kind of figures trying to grab people by the lapels and like shake them and say, stop talking about 9/11. Stop talking about foreign policy as if 9/11 happened yesterday, basically.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And it also had the effects on the left are interesting as well, because the Democrats at that time did become opposed to the Iraq war, not as much as they would like to claim in hindsight, because in 2004, that was when it was the most contentious issue. But a lot of these guys who were running for office voted for the Iraq war, such as John Kerry, who eventually became the nominee, and this figure known as Howard Dean, which I guess he became back. He was a MSNBC guest a lot of times during the Trump era. I don't think he still goes on. He has to be pretty old.
Well,
now.
he was DNC chair. He was the DNC chair for a while after that. Yeah,
he was DNC chair for a while after. He was Vermont governor, and he caught on for a bit by making the Iraq opposition to the Iraq war his center position in his campaign, which contrasted with a lot of these guys who were elected, federal lawmakers who had voted for the war. And it created, there was this left wing, growing their support for opposition to the war and pulling us out and withdrawing completely. While John Kerry, went back as like, I opposed the Iraq, or I supported the Iraq war before opposing it. Or there was this famous line of him saying something of that sort. And every conservatives all mocked him as flip-flopper, and they even sold John Kerry flip-flops at the time due to how much he was flip-flopping over the Iraq war. But he was doing that much more so than any of these other candidates. But Howard Dean eventually flamed out and he may have won like a state or two. He did not turn out to be as potent of a candidate as people thought, and John Kerry won. John Kerry was ultimately a Iraq war supporter, but the reckoning had to wait till 2008, where Barack Obama made his opposition to the Iraq war the center part of his campaign against Hillary Clinton, who had voted for it. And that was one of the reasons that he defeated Hillary Clinton, was over the Iraq war. But the left, there was this assumption that if Obama becomes the president, we're going to do no more of these foreign interventions. We're going to, have a more reasonable foreign policy. But that wasn't even the case. Liberals were the ones pushing the hardest to get us to intervene in Libya. They were also pushing the hardest to get us to intervene in Syria and many other places as well. And even during Iraq, there was a lot of liberals who wanted us to intervene in Sudan because there was the supposed genocide going on in South Sudan at that time. And there was like George Clooney and all these people were very eager into Sudan. And you're like, well, wait a minute. You're complaining about us being in Iraq, but you also want us to get into fucking Sudan? Like, that doesn't make sense at all. So even the liberal opposition to the war was very shallow and very thin, because ultimately once we got out of Iraq, it turned into the biggest interventionists the planet. And as I mentioned before, in 2016, the Iraq War was not an issue. Nobody cared that Hillary Clinton was a hawk. Nobody cared at all, and not Democratic voters didn't care. And then in 2020, hawkishness was the defining trait of all the major candidates. I think only Bernie Sanders was once again the only major candidate who was not an eager interventionist, while Biden obviously was an eager interventionist compared to at least compared to Trump and compared to Bernie Sanders. And that became once again the defining position of the Democratic Party. And so a lot of millennials and Gen Xers still have this mindset that like Democrats are anti-war, they're opposed to it, based on what happened with Iraq, which it became more that they just hated Bush. They hated the Bush base, which that later, those people then got better politics and became the Trump base, and they didn't want to associate with the Iraq war anymore. But ultimately, when it came back to humanitarian interventions or saving the poor little Libyans or whoever that they were wanting to save, they then became hardcore interventionists. And we can see this with the Democratic Party today for Ukraine, where the Progressive House Caucus issued a letter saying maybe we should, back away from Ukraine. And they had to retract that letter. And this is the Progressive Caucus. They have to be fervently in favor of unlimited funds and unlimited weaponry for the Ukrainians, and they can't do it. And the anti-war movement today is really just libertarians, the ones who still exist, and like weird leftists who get money from Russia. That's like it. That is it for the anti-war movement today. Among the general public does not want another Iraq. If we were wanting to send troops to Ukraine, there would be majority opposition to that. I think there would be majority opposition to sending a large contingent of troops outside of the few troops that we've sent to Syria. They would not support a large-scale intervention on the sides of Iraq or anywhere near the sides of Iraq now. But in terms of the people who really care about this issue, who are really driven by this issue, the people who are what remains of the anti-war movement, it's really just the Libertarian Party, like ANCAPs, hankies, and what these, as I said, these weird leftists who still go on RT, which there's not many who still go on RT, but that's it. And so it's not much of a movement at all, and it is dead. And most of them, even liberals and leftists, even the ones who are in DSA, really support Ukraine, and they also want an intervention into Syria because they sympathize with the left-wing Kurds who are involved in the Syrian civil war. So the death of the anti-war left is readily apparent, and they've moved back to a natural state that's been common for the Democratic Party ever since FDR. Is that it's always, and really actually since Woodrow Wilson, even though that's a little bit more of a complicated discussion, we'll say FDR, is that they want America to be the world's policeman, to intervene for humanitarian reasons all over the world and spread democracy. And this is shared by everyone from DSA supposed militants to Nancy Pelosi.
Yeah, this is really important, Scott, because it is a little bit of a tangent because we're talking about contemporary issues. We're talking about Ukraine. We're talking about Trump. But it's important to understand a lot of this stuff in the context of the politics surrounding Iraq and the initial invasion, because the partisanship exacerbated these differences beyond what they actually were at a philosophical level. And so at the time, again, you couldn't say that George Bush was invading Iraq for libtard reasons, but he absolutely was. And you also couldn't say that libtards were basically more against Bush than they were against the war per se. But now in retrospect, that's like obvious as hell. There was a guy who tweeted this the other day. He was quoting someone, like a leftist critic, I think. And he was quoting the guy, and the guy was saying that now it's pretty much clear that liberals really just kind of hated Bush more than they hated the Iraq war. And he was quoting this guy as if what he was saying was like so obviously stupid. And I looked at the tweet and I was like, no, this is obviously true. And so the idea, like the fact that there wasn't actually that much daylight ideologically between Bush and his critics was not something that was visible to the American public during the debates over the Iraq War, because it was so contentious and it was so split in a partisan way that people actually thought that they were debating like kind of legitimate, substantial differences between everyone. But you really weren't. It was really mostly just shadowboxing between differing liberal principles. And it really kind of, again, Trump really kind of did bring this to the fore, that the idea that liberal opposition to the Bush administration was really more based on, kind of like cultural resentments and kind of caricature stereotypes of who Bush was, and more importantly, who he represented. The idea that it was kind of like Christian, it was white, it was patriotic, it was Southern. Again, not to say that the patriotism was expressed in a productive manner for the Iraq War. It was like really counterproductive and incredibly destructive. But the idea that the liberal opposition was more based on things like that than this kind of principled alternative viewpoint of how we should be conducting ourselves on the world stage, that kind of got vindicated over time, right? Like, I think that's kind of what you were getting at, that like, they really didn't care about like the general direction of American foreign policy in terms of like whether America was going to be using soft and even hard power in certain instances to like impose our values around the world. Once Trump, in the post-Trump era, once liberals became pretty, or even during Obama actually, once liberals became pretty confident in who was defining those values and what it meant to have American values on the world stage, they pretty much dropped all opposition to like interrogating how we were imposing those on the world, right? Once liberals were pretty confident that like American values meant like, social justice regarding like race issues and issues of gender ideology or whatever, they pretty much were like, yeah, we're fine with all of this. And even now, like the kind of anti-Russian belligerence that kind of at this point has just risen to the term of like anti-Russian racism. It's risen to that level or whatever. This is stuff that in 2004 and 5 and 6, these people would act like it was completely beyond them. It was something they would never engage in. It was like kind of just like the most it was almost like they would have called that like an absurd caricature of even like George W. Bush. Like that was a Bush administration things, kind of jingoistic, kind of crude caricatures of other nations and stuff like that, almost like serving a pretext for kind of hostilities with them. They would have acted like it was completely beyond them. And that's exactly what them do now. This, like you said, it's just like completely mainstream Democrat politics now to essentially sound like a Bush era neoconservative, but for just like differing enemies. And so it's important because it kind of shows how a lot of the stuff in the Iraq era was a kind of artificially partisan inflation of really minor political differences into this like, kind of cataclysmic divide that existed in America that, again, it wasn't even as much as they wanted to say. Like the way you pointed out, 2004 was very absurd because everyone in 2004 basically on the Democrat side had to build themselves as like staunch, ardent opponents of the Iraq War, and like their entire top ticket roster was just senators who voted to authorize the invasion. It was like John Kerry, Hillary Clinton supported, Joe Biden supported it. Joe Biden was an Iraq war booster. Absolutely. He's the president. He's like the president now. Nobody on the left even cares or talks about this at all. And then, you had Kerry and Edwards that were the president and VP, and both of them were senators on record who voted for the Iraq war. It's just unambiguous. And they just had to do this like really awkward distancing that like, again, like, in retrospect, Iraq was a disaster. It was a really bad idea, but it wasn't just embarrassing for the right. It was so embarrassing for the left too. Like you had these two guys as the VP and the presidential candidate, and they like had no real rhetorical way to get out of like what they were supporting a year prior to when they were running for president,
Yeah, exactly. And I think even when liberals were making fun of our reasons for getting into Iraq, which is like freedom, and that was a huge thing, is like freedom, and they would mock that. Now, if you say we need to stay in Afghanistan to spread black girl magic and LGBT rights, they'd nod seriously and say, "Oh, exactly. They need to learn about black girl magic." And so it's just you need to use different euphemisms for why you need to stay there, but these people will support it. So the Democrats are back to their natural state of being the more ardent interventionists. Still, Republicans are on an instinctual level because they always want to rally to the flag. They're always going to love the military. They're always going to love strength and blowing shit up. But they, at the same time, there is more skepticism of these war efforts or these interventionist efforts than there is on the left. I mean, the only people who oppose funding the Ukraine war are now Republicans. I mean, Democrats, there's like very few of them who even, they have to be ardent Ukraine war supporters and it's only Republicans who show any desire to end the war. But something that's different. I think one thing we need to conclude on the subject is, why did we choose Saddam or Iraq as the invasion point? Why was there so much desire for this to go into Iraq? Is that, the foreign policy establishment saw Saddam as a rogue actor that we couldn't trust and would just do crazy stuff that we couldn't really control or contain. And they felt that Saddam could end up being a terror supporter, and they thought he was a terror supporter at the time, but he was not. And they felt that they just had to take out this rogue actor, and maybe they could turn Iraq into a democracy as a cherry on top, as an addition to that. Obviously, they did not they created some sort of government, but it's a very weak Iraq. And I think with the globalist American empire, it did, compared to some of these other interventions we've been in that have been total disasters. I mean, Vietnam was a complete catastrophe. I mean, the whole country became communist 2 years after we left. I mean, it was Afghanistan. The Taliban took over even before we left. But in Iraq, we now have this weak government that, it still has Iranian influence, but we don't really have to worry. Well, we only have to worry about Iraq with some terrorists gaining a foothold there, but we have troops there to bomb them and take them out now, and maybe some Iranian militants. But compared to, where they had to worry about Saddam, threatening other people in the region and stuff, and now for the globalist American empire's interest, they don't have to worry about that now. And so, even though it was a major setback for them and it did have a failure, the long-term effect of it is oh, well, we created this weak Middle Eastern state that we no longer have to worry about that much. And for their mindset, they may think that was a win of its own, but obviously for the American people, they're like, what the hell? That was not worth the cost of this war. But for the foreign policy establishment, they'd probably be like, you win some, you lose some, and they bounce back from the war.
Do you remember, Scott, the Colin Powell speech to the UN? That was another kind of Iraq moment where it was seen as this big kind of historical moment where Colin Powell, because you got to remember, for people who don't know, one of the pretexts for the Iraq war, right, Scott, was that actually it's kind of it's just funny to even talk about this stuff. That was actually that America was actually just enforcing international law against Saddam Hussein, where he was basically not cooperating with what was it, the IAEA or UN resolutions to basically reveal the goings on in his country in terms of weapons development. And so Colin Powell basically goes to the UN and presents this case that I don't know. I get it was seen as momentous, but I don't know if it was actually persuasive. Maybe the general public just thought it was because it felt like it should be or whatever. But they were showing pictures, remember, of the moving trucks, the moving tractor trailers, where basically Saddam Hussein is developing WMDs, which was such a buzzword at the time, weapons of mass destruction. It was biological, chemical, and nuclear weapons. And there were all these tenuous connections made between Iraq and other countries and their relationships and what they were buying and selling from them. And that like, yeah, so Colin Powell was like holding up little vials of things. I don't even know what it was. It anthrax? I don't even know what it was. But
Yeah,
yeah,
it doesn't matter, but it was
I
like,
know,
yeah,
I
he went
know.
out there, and Colin Powell had a lot of respectability at that time because he's former Joint Chiefs of Staff who oversaw the first Persian Gulf War, a black Republican, so based, and he was, the Secretary of State, so he had a lot of clout, and that's why they sent Colin Powell out because they thought that he would be more convincing on a world stage, and sending Rumsfeld or Cheney or someone else out there. They felt that Colin Powell would be the most convincing figure for this, and it worked. It worked. I mean, it didn't convince the world to join in, but that's another funny thing is about how anti-France America was. That's now actually remembering that is like the whole country turned into hating France because France did not join in. And the famous example is French fries becoming freedom fries over this, and people refusing, talking about how the French are losers and they lose everything and they're cowards for not joining in. But the French were turned out to be 100% correct that they didn't want to go in the war. But the whole country began hating France for not joining in the coalition of the willing against the Iraqis. Which, funny enough, it's the people who joined in from Europe are the same people who are insanely hawkish about Ukraine now. It's like the Poles, the Balts, the Brits too. I mean, Tony Blair took them into the war, and also Australia, I think, was also there. It's all the people who are like the most eager for the Ukraine war. But it really
I
showed
remember
who are the gays' most loyal soldiers. It's Poland, UK, and others.
I remember Scott, like conservatives, they would start like openly mocking the fact that like the French lost to the Nazis so drastically,
Yeah.
it was like
Yeah, you'd be
became
speaking German without us. It's
yeah,
like,
they were
oh man,
like they were seen as like these stereotypical cowards, which is like so funny if like you actually like open a book and you learn about like, well, basically, I mean, most continental European countries like are basically like spent like I don't know what percentage of their time like at war with their own neighbors, right? But it's pretty much most most of continental Europe is like spent most of their time in and out of fighting with their like like through territorial disputes and stuff like that. But during the Iraq War, yeah, France was seen as like these cowards that like were totally averse to to conflict, and we resorted to like these like really crude stereotypes. And again, it's funny to look back and say this, but like at the same time that like America was trying to resurrect the image of ourselves as like the heroes of the Second World War, the American right was also making fun of France and the kind of the defeat that they suffered in the Second World War at the exact same time that we're trying to like conjure up images that like this is really all just like World War II Part 2. We were just
and that
like
fed into it
openly
because it's
mocking
like
them.
the whole Europe would be speaking German without America, which maybe not the most accurate assumption. Sort of, I mean, in the general sphere, may be true. I mean, and also you might need a worse example of what would be happening to Europeans besides speaking German. But besides that, that was part of the World War II mindset, and at that time, I mean, World War II does dominate how Americans view the world and view history because it's like the only historical event there. But at that time, it still had this very patriotic resonance of that. We're the good guys and we're sending out the band of brothers again to kick some dictator's ass and save America. And it's like this some blonde-haired, blue-eyed guy saving, concentration camp victims or the poor Iraqis, and that's the mindset of America. But now World War II is that we have to worry about those blonde-haired Chads in America turning into Nazis, and somebody like Trump as Hitler, or even someone like as milquetoast as DeSantis as Hitler, and that's really what we have to worry about now is like the threat from within rather than the threat from without. Even though they still make the Nazi World War II allusions to Putin and others.
Yeah, it is. It's worth like kind of talking about a little bit because I did mention this earlier. Because again, like World War II did serve, as like the moral foundation, like Nuremberg and stuff is like the foundation of like the post like the American dominated order. but it really is true that in a way, like there was like, I don't want to say like an alternative understanding of World War II there, but there was, right, Scott? There was like this domestic patriotic understanding of World War II where like it wasn't completely dominated by this idea that like all white people are latent Nazis, or this like, you know, kind of like weird obsession with the Holocaust and stuff like that, right? Like there was like a domestic version of the World War II narrative in America while the Greatest Generation was really old but still alive for the most part, where it was like the American side of things. You know what I mean? It was kind of like it was
implicitly saying white Americans are bringing democracy and freedom to the world, and they're awesome because they're so welcoming and nice. I guess it was like an accurate depiction of white Americans as being open and non-racist to the whole world. But now, you know, they would show the like Nazi GIs while like the Hispanic or Black GIs is teaching them about democracy.
And the military at the time, I guess this is true too. I mean, I'm sure it was changing. It was changing, but it is, in my memory, it's still mostly true to say that at the time, our post 9/11 military still kind of looked American. The public image of it was like unambiguously American. And that's also not true anymore. So like it was easier to understand, to view our military in the through the World War II lens, because the soldiers like literally still looked like our World War II vets. You know, it was like an overwhelmingly white force. You know, the footage from like Iraq, Afghanistan, it looked like it was mostly guys from the Midwest, guys from the South. Whether or not you like agreed with the war.
83%, I mean, 83% of the casualties in the war on terror were white.
And the military still
more than the general population, because I mean the population at the beginning of the 2000s, it just had gone under 70% white, and then it was 63% white in 2010. So it was way disproportionate from the population in general, is how many whites were dying, were the ones fighting and dying in these places.
Yeah, they kind of did enjoy this slightly unimpeachable like reputation. That started to go, you know, there were these little things during the Iraq War. I call them little. They weren't little at the time. Things like Abu Ghraib. And, you know, there was this kind of attempt from American liberals to subvert the image of the military. I mean, it's not like they were making it up, right? There were like abuses that the media was kind of like amplifying tremendously, that again, in retrospect, like didn't matter. No one cared. It was like, oh, these soldiers are like engaging in like inappropriate behavior, et cetera, et cetera. And like, again, a lot of it was true, but it was just it was obviously being inflated for like domestic partisan purposes. And so overall, like, yeah, at the time, the American military was still seen as this like profoundly American institution. Almost everyone I know which isn't a lot of people, which is another fundamental distinction between Iraq and Vietnam because of the draft. You know, part of the reason that the Iraq and Afghanistan campaigns just don't linger in the public consciousness is that it's it's much less likely that you'll meet someone that's served in overseas in Iraq or Afghanistan, whereas that wasn't the case in Vietnam. You know, everyone knew people that were in Vietnam during that like era. But yeah, like it if you did meet people like that, they were like white Southerner. You know what I mean? They fit what you thought at the time was like a stereotype of what an American military member looked like.
Yeah, and I think that made more of the Team Red or Red America more willing to support the wars, that they saw themselves as the ones fighting and dying. It was an expression of themselves, and maybe it was very implicit in why they were supporting this, but they still thought that the old America was the one fighting and dying and fighting for the greatness of the old America rather than the new America that was beginning to be birthed at the time. Been you know, in the stages of birth for many years, but it was fully coming to fruition.
There was a right wing talking point at the time, Scott. I don't know. I mean, just to kind of give a historical kind of tidbit or whatever, there was a right wing talking point at the time that like you you don't question the wisdom of sending troops overseas once they're sent, right? That was like a popular conservative talking point after 9/11 and during the Iraq War, that like whatever you think of the decision to invade Iraq, once we have soldiers on the ground in these other countries, you like the etiquette, the patriotic etiquette is to stop, to not question the wisdom of it, because you're like undermining the mission. And so the military kind of, I mean, it was a bit cynical. It was tremendously cynical looking back on it. But like, yeah, the military, it was seen as this kind of like very morally pure institution where even liberals had to like pivot they had to like tread very carefully, that like their opposition to the war had absolutely nothing to do with questioning the kind of moral credibility of the United States military, right? They were in, Bush kind of had their number a little bit, even disaster. Neoconservatives kind of did run the table on them, right? Like liberals had to be very careful about how they opposed the war. You know what I mean? Because they couldn't be seen as bringing the credibility or the moral legitimacy of the American military into question.
Oh, and that was all part of the great nationalism and Toby Keith nationalism of the time. I think a way to conclude is there are some positive things to take away from Iraq, or maybe from what occurred. I think, as I said earlier, one, that type of an intervention probably cannot happen unless there's another 9/11 or a similar level attack. Everyone, sometimes I've said like, oh, we could go intervene and invade Iran. No, we can't. I mean, and also the level of casualties. Like, even if you're looking at the one from Ukraine, it's remarkable about how the level of casualties Ukraine and Russia are willing to take, far more than modern America. I mean, if we lost 10,000 soldiers a year, there would be hell to pay in America for that. Even with it's a volunteer force, like people would be very upset by that. So we're probably not going to have that type of intervention again. Well, the type of interventions we're going to do is using proxies who are willing to fight and die for the gay, which usually that's failed a lot of times, from the South Vietnamese to the Afghan army to many other examples throughout the world. Ukrainians are the first like reliable, dependable people who are willing to fight to the last drop of blood for our interests and be proxy soldiers for us. I mean, they feel that they are fighting for their own interests, but it's also the same. And they're the first like prize proxy soldier or proxy army we've ever had or at least in a very long time. And that's going to be the type of wars, is that we fund and equip other people to fight wars in our interests. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but the positive thing is we're never going to have any type of large scale intervention like that. A second good thing, and I would say that this is largely positive, is that I don't think you will have that type of cringe civic nationalism as represented in that ad council ad where they're saying like, I am an American. If they were able to do that type of patriotism again, it would be used for ridiculous ideas like passing amnesty or having another black holiday or passing some really terrible legislation. If all Americans were able to come together and unite, it would be coming together, unite for really terrible ideas. And I think it is like good that you have a bit of fracturing in America and you're not achieving that moment of unity, because if we did have that moment of unity, the leadership would be able to pass terrible legislation. And I guess on a further thought, this is not, I guess you could say is positive, as the Republican Party and conservatism has improved a lot from those days. I think we talked about this a lot in the podcast, that there was this opportunity for Republican leaders to seek to do something authentically nationalist after 9/11, and they chose not to, simply because we didn't have the leadership for it. But the average Republican was for this, and the average Republican, probably even the average American, absolutely hated Muslims. After 9/11, people really, really hated Muslims after 9/11, which today, now, like, if someone proposed a Muslim ban today, people are like, why? We don't need them. They're natural conservatives. I mean, in some ways, you see conservatives now celebrating Muslim immigrants because they're like the only people to have a riot over their schools teaching transgender stuff, which happened in Michigan, where it's like, I forget which city it was, but all these Muslims were had very aggressive school board meetings over their schools teaching trans stuff. So now conservatives are like celebrating Muslim immigrants rather than wanting to ban them simply for that reason. So it's just a lot of changes that have happened since then. But I think in general, maybe besides the oppression of Muslims, but I mean, Islamic terrorism is not as much of a problem as it was even 5 or 6 years ago, as it is now, and so it's a harder issue to campaign on. But in general, the Republican Party is much better, and so is the conservative movement. The only real voices to have any skepticism of foreign interventions are now from the right, and that's largely due to Trump and to a smaller part due to Tucker. And so that's something to be positive about the changes we've seen over time. So, Night Revision, any final thoughts on Iraq before we get to the cognitive elite questions?
No, not really. It's difficult to it's kind of difficult because these issues were they seemed so important and they completely dominated everything when they were relevant. And then now that they've left, it's almost hard to remember how it was all anybody was talking about. But yeah, I do want to reiterate your point about like bipartisanship in America usually being awful. Conservatives have kind of been able to realize that a little bit more. Or I guess the voter base, rather, the Republican voter base has been able to realize that a little bit more. But Iraq was really a bipartisan decision, and it was terrible. And the next one that they had down the pipe after Iraq was the amnesty, like you mentioned, which again George W. Bush tried to get through also. And so it did expose weaknesses in the conservative movement. They're kind of the way they were held hostage basically over questions of patriotism, supporting the military, like bloodlust, justifiably so, like bloodlust after like 9/11 and things like that. And yeah, so in a way it's good that it's difficult to remember how salient the Middle Eastern policy and Iraq and Afghanistan were to American politics, because again, like it's difficult to, maybe for people who are more politically involved now, it's maybe hard for you to believe, but it was actually much worse then, because it was so, again, like the stranglehold that this stuff had on all political discussion, and especially on the right, it was just unbelievable. And so basically any alternative to that at the time would have been better. And so once the grip kind of went away, even though things are still crazy, a lot of that is just the fault of the establishment, the fact that they don't want to change. They've kind of imposed.
Or it's the fault of the country itself. I mean, the country is much
Yeah.
worse than it was 20 years ago.
That is true too. Like, yeah, it is true. So that it's still, it's just better. I don't know. It's like I said, I guess talking about the misalignment of politics after 9/11, the implication there is that, we're like more reasonably aligned. The left, the practical positions it supports, the policies it supports, the party it supports, and then the right, things make more sense. And 9/11 gave the establishment an opportunity to kind of hold people together who really didn't belong together in any meaningful way. And so even though it's hard to like kind of have this retrospective view on things, because it really did dominate so hard, it's good that it's great that it's all gone. It was a terrible, terrible moment for the right, but the country in general.
No, I would agree with all of those takes, and I think the one thing you have to say, the concluding thought, is that whenever you look back in the past and you're like, well, things are better, maybe politically and stuff, and you're like, well, Republicans were back then. They were actually worse, but the country was better in of itself. I mean, we were a wider country. There was more reasonable standards that were shared by the mainstream. The majority of Americans oppose gay marriage. And just imagine how the American population views of teaching transgender stuff to elementary school kids would have been if they had polled on that, because that was an idea that no one would have even considered. And even like the Black Lives Matter stuff and like having Juneteenth as a national holiday, a lot of these things were not present then. It was a much wider country, much probably country to be more optimistic about back then. But at the same time, the political situation, our ability to affect politics is probably greater while the country is worse, if that makes any sense. So that'll be,
I would agree. I would agree with that. Yeah.
so that will be the concluding thought. Now we'll go to the COD Elite questions. As a reminder, you too can get the power to ask me questions or suggest guests and topics if you sign up for the COD Elite option at Highly Respected Substack. And that's at highly-respected.substack.com. And make sure to sign up for the IQ Summits while you're there. So we have 2 questions today. One question actually aligns with the conversation we just had about Iraq. And this comes from New England Refugee. He talks about the History Channel and about back in the 2000s and how it was teaching a lot of patriotic history and was really actually having history documentaries on there. You know, he was worried about pro-war propaganda at the time with History Channel and stuff. But he said if you watched a lot of History Channel, it would have made you very patriotic and pro-old stock America. And now it's just reality TV show that pumps the same awful propaganda as anywhere else, he says. And so he asked, what are your thoughts on the 2000s History Channel, and did you watch it? And yes, I was a huge fan of the History Channel as a kid. I was very excited when we moved to Tennessee, and they offered History Channel on cable news on our cable provider. So I was very excited to watch it, and it really had a lot of good stuff back then. And even just during the day, you could just, like, they would have random documentaries on, like, Napoleon. I mean, mostly it was a lot of World War II stuff, but they also had documentaries on, like, the Civil War, also documentaries and features on, like, old murders or crime stuff. And you could just learn a lot about the country and history through, you know, reasonable documentaries that are not woke and they were not, like, made to be really stupid. And usually they were well done works that they were providing. A lot of it came from, like, the BBC and other, and, like, overseas providers. So it was, like, very good. I think the channel today obviously is terrible because they got more ratings through these reality TV shows and other woke stuff. And even the modern history stuff they do is just now really, like, stupid and, like, over the top, and it's not as, like, informative as it was before. But it was a feature, you know, 2000s History Channel is like a feature of, like, the old America that was there 20 years ago, and how just, like, things have fundamentally changed. And even just, like, these small things that you would have is that you could turn, you know, if you had cable, I don't have cable. I don't really have a TV, but at that time you could just flip the channels and you could actually find something that was informative and not insulting to your intelligence. And so yeah, I would have positive opinions about the History Channel. Nightmare Vision, were you a big History Channel fan?
Not really. What year did they just get consumed with? Was that the channel that got consumed with just, like, Hitler and at a certain point?
Hitler became, like, the thing in, like, the mid 2000s. Like, it just became just, like, World War II and Hitler stuff. But there was still, like, decent stuff at the time in the mid 2000s. But then in the late 2000s, it went to Ancient Aliens and more ridiculous stuff and, like, reality TV shows. So, like, the early 2000s is very good, and then in the mid 2000s it became a little too obsessed with Hitler. But then it was still better than what it was today.
Yeah, you don't want to be too obsessed. You need to.
Yeah, you don't want to.
You want to have the appropriate amount of obsession with Hitler. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah.
So that was the History Channel. So I guess if that's all the thoughts on that, we will go to the second question, which comes from Jack, and I need to pull that question up right now. So, I mean, Nationalism didn't have many great takes on the other subject, but I think he'll have a lot of takes on this one. Jack, and this is a current event thing that has nothing to do with Iraq, and he was asking me, regarding the news that Trump will be arrested next week, do you think that this is some grand strategy by the left to make him the nominee in an attempt to get an easy opponent in 2024? Or is it simply that these prosecutors want to be known as the ones who took down Trump? It is definitely the latter. The idiotic DeSantis shills that are all over Twitter are trying to find a way to use this event that's clearly upsets the base and is clearly an attack on the entire right, and trying to find some way to attack Trump by being a victim of political persecution. So they first were like, they were saying, like, oh, they're trying to elevate him to an easy opponent. Like Matt Walsh was suggesting this on Twitter last week. And they made up this bullshit back in 2015 and 2016 in the primary about how Trump was a Clinton plant to ruin based. Well, they didn't use base at the time. That was still an alt-right term at the time. But the awesome Marco Rubio. And that was why they pushed Trump in 2016. But it was like total bullshit. No, it's not that they want an easy opponent. They want Trump in jail. And this DA, this New York DA, wants to make a name for himself, Alvin Bragg, and he feels that his constituents want this, and this will help him when he's running for re-election, and he can make a name for himself. Maybe he could even run for mayor or some statewide office or Congress or something, and he feels that this could be the first stepping stone in that, and that's why they want to take down Trump. There is nothing about easy opponent. I think the fact that the liberal press and even a few Democrats are expressing their skepticism over this, and they're like, "This is a weak case. This is not the indictment we want." The indictment they want is the federal indictment that the special prosecutor is working on. They do not want these city and state attorneys like messing up what the indictment they want. They want the federal indictment. And this event is going to help Trump. I think it's also going to be like ridiculous charges that maybe if he had a change of venue, he would easily defeat them. And they're elevating these charges. I mean, if the New York Times is saying that this case is weak and terrible, it's bad. But to the answer to the question, it's clearly the latter. It's like this prosecutor wants to be known as the one who took down Trump. It has nothing to do with elevating Trump and to get an easy opponent in 2024. We heard enough of these ridiculous theories back in 2016, and guess what? Trump won. And a lot of the other candidates that were supposedly going to win, if it wasn't for Trump, would probably have lost. Like I think both Ted Cruz and Jeb Bush would have lost, and probably even Marco Rubio. So, Nightmare Vision, any thoughts on that?
Oh man, don't bring up the DeSantis shills in front of me, Scott. You know how mad I get. I can't stand those people. Man, let me tell you, I feel like so much conservative analysis does this thing where like they are too clever by half, and like they think they're really smart. Like, oh, actually, like the idea that they're doing this to Trump to elevate a weaker candidate is like a higher order analysis that someone tries to give off to sound smart, but it actually makes no sense. And that's actually not how people work psychologically whatsoever. It's like, no, they're doing this specifically because they want to do it. Like they want the result. Like the idea that libs don't want Trump to die. Like they obviously want this guy in prison for the rest of his life. Like the idea that they're like
DeSantis chills, and that's actually the funny thing. So does
absolutely
the conservative movement, because the whole impetus of a DeSantis candidacy is that Trump will be indicted and that he will drop out, and DeSantis doesn't have to do a head-to-head competition. Because if Trump stays in, he's going to win the primary. The only way he doesn't become the nominee if he drops out, and they want him to be indicted. And so they can get a real threat to the state. The guy who's not indicted is not a threat and is eating pudding with 3 fingers. You know, that's the real threat to the establishment.
They are so bad because I see them constantly doing it. They're on Twitter all day acting like, why do people ever say anything negative about DeSantis? We should look at them. Look at Trump biting at the ankles of the colossus, the political gargantuan known as Ron DeSantis. It's like this.
Yeah, Ron DeSantis would arrest this DA and send him to Guantanamo Bay. Like they imagine like a DeSantis that doesn't exist. But that's another subject. But
it's so delusional. And the other thing is that the way this relates to the indictment. I mean, they are trying to say this. They are wrong. It is crazy how much right-wing people are just wrong all the time. They're trying to create this false momentum against Trump on like social media, and it's filled with people like, again, like you mentioned, Matt Walsh. They're wrong. Ben Shapiro, Matt Walsh, all these guys are always wrong. And no one ever just says that. Like people debate them or they argue with them, but no, it's like they're just wrong all the time. Half of the guys, or I don't know, it's probably more than half, Scott. Half of the guys that are doing all that shilling, they didn't even support Trump initially in 2015 and 2016. And now they're like, oh, we need to
didn't even support him for the general election. And also, a lot of these people predict that Trump win a single primary in 2016.
Yeah. Mainstream conservative political analysis is garbage. You should always just throw it into the trash. Do not even listen to it. They are so detached. And so like now they're saying we need to move beyond it. And then they're using the indictment as if it were like further evidence why we should like move beyond Trump rather than like kind of take a moment to seriously understand that we're at the stage in like American decline where we're just trying to throw the opposition in jail so they don't get an opportunity to be democratically elected back into the presidency. It's like, under normal circumstances, if you're like a political commentator in a country and you're a part of the party or the organization where like your nominal head has like people are gunning for him, where they literally want him to die in jail, your response, the normal response to that should not be like, yeah, we should just actually let him die in jail so we can move on to this like new, like unimpressive, high-pitched voiced, irrelevant like local politician, like state governor or something like that. It's also
going to take down the entire establishment too.
Yeah, it's just such like, yeah, absolutely. It's such an inappropriate, it's such a forced, inappropriate like take. And then also like, again, just to get to the initial question, yeah, like that's just dumb, like basement level conservative analysis that like they always try to do in order to cope for the fact that they're like completely bought and paid for and they're like corrupt beyond all the conservative grifters. Just don't listen to them. No, they want to indict Trump because they want to indict Trump. I don't know, like, you know, you brought up the fact that they want the federal indictment over this like smaller scale thing, but it's very obvious that like a lot of these judges or whatever and you know, these lawyers involved in these things, they're completely corrupt, just like the wider libtard establishment. They have like this deranged hatred for this guy. They're probably trying to bite at any opportunity they can. You know, the fact that they're trying to relitigate, like, what does this have to do with, Scott? Like that porn star,
Stormy
like
Daniels
him?
payout. Yeah, it's like the most
like,
minor thing.
It's probably not, you know, even if it doesn't go in, the idea that the general sentiment is anything other than we need to arrest Trump to make it illegal for him to ever be president again. The idea that that position, in other words, is like cynical. This is absurd. No, that is the sincerely held belief of everyone in America on the left, from like Joe Biden down to like the 50 follower communist irony cell Twitter account. Like, they all unironically believe this. That is their sincere belief. That's why they're trying to do this. Absolutely.
I agree. It's unfortunate what's happening, but I think he's going to get a massive boost in support from Republican voters. I think the federal indictment may prove more problematic for Trump, even if that happens. But I think one thing that this local indictment may be occurring simply because Democrats are getting nervous that a federal indictment won't come, and so they're just like, screw it, we're gonna indict him on our own. And that's because they want Trump in jail, and they really fear Trump becoming president again. And they feel that this will hurt his chances of becoming president. In a general election, it would probably not help him. I would say more of a federal indictment would hurt him more than this, because I think this is just like, people don't give a shit about Stormy Daniels. I think even the fact that most people see this is just like as a multi-prosecutional weak prosecution, it's probably going to do more to help Trump. I would say help him in the general election. It's hard to say what they would do that, but it's going to help him in the primary. And Meatball Ron is going to have a lot of trouble distinguishing himself as the true threat to the system when against the supposedly crooked and establishment-friendly Trump, who is under indictment due to his political beliefs, while DeSantis is just out. This reminds
me, Scott, like when someone on the right just gets like nakedly persecuted by the state, and like internet, like online leftists will be talking about how like, no, actually they're not a threat. They're trying to shore these people up so they can reinforce the false binary. It's like, shut up, man. Like, they're canceling people. They can't access their bank account. They get fired from their jobs. Like, there's so much cope over like kind of mainstream conservative and like leftist political analysis regarding like, actually the guy that the government is openly persecuting is like not actually being persecuted. It's like, what? That makes absolutely no sense. Like, they're obviously being persecuted because the state wants to persecute them. And when it comes to Trump, like whether this goes anywhere, it reminds me of like the impeachment thing where, you know, they just want to be able to say like the twice impeached president. Like, so as long as they'll throw indictments at him, even if they're really desperate, because they want to kind of create that air of corruption, right? That air that like, it's like an untrustworthy person. So it's like, oh, well, he has these indictments and this litigation and all these legal problems, right? Like it's like they're trying to tie these like stones to him to weigh him down. So like, even if they don't go anywhere, I feel like they just want when you talk about Trump, they want people to be talking about things like the Mar-a-Lago raid, the FBI raid, the indictment and stuff like that, to make him look like this incredibly compromised figure.
Exactly right. But it won't work, at least for the primary, but we'll have to see with the general. But that is it for today on Highly Respected. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. And so, Nightmare Vision, any final words and thoughts on and suggestions on how the good people can follow you?
You can follow me on Twitter at God Close My Eyes. It's great to be here. It was a great show. Thanks for having me.
And thanks for coming on, Nightmare Vision. And so until next time, stay respected.